So the question is this: how would you explain the Trinity in a way that a Muslim could understand and maybe accept? By the way, the answer you're going to hear is the subject matter expert answer. I'm telling you that right now because his understanding of the Trinity is pretty remarkable. So.
Well, with that setup now.
Yeah, I know I do that. Jay doesn't like it when I do that either. But it's true. I want you guys to pay attention to what he says and take notes because it's going to be valuable.
Yeah, so one of the first things to be said is Muslims will point to two texts in the Quran that are determinative for them on this issue. In Surah 42:11 and 112:4, notice those are just the inverse of the other. 42:11 is 112:4 in the reverse. So these are two texts of the Quran that say there's nothing like Allah and there's nothing comparable to Allah. In the Muslim mind, Christians are guilty of shirk, which means associating a partner with Allah. We're saying that there is something like him, there is something comparable to him. Now, the thing you have to remember at this point is that's just not the truth about what we're saying. We are not saying that there is this God and now there's this other figure that we've added onto him, named Jesus. The God of the Bible is not first the Father and then sometime down the road the Son. He has always been who he is, the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We don't think of Jesus as some other God associated with the Father. He is one in essence with the Father, always has been. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is, when you think about it, is it really the case that a Unitarian deity, and what I mean by that is a non-Trinitarian God who's one person, monopersonal, he has no relationship with another. From all eternity, he's isolated, non-communicative, he's not essentially in fellowship. It's just, that's all foreign to him. Love, fellowship, communication, all these things are foreign to his nature. If any of these things are experienced by him, it's because he entered into those situations by creating. So these things are contingent for the God of Islam. These are contingent realities, dependent on creation. If Allah loves, it's because he created a creature to love. If he communicates, it's because he created a creature to communicate with. See, we don't think that as Christians. We think that God has always had within himself, as the triune God, a fullness of life, love, communication. That's who he is by nature. And it's out of the overflow of that he made the world and invites us to join in that eternal fellowship with him, the members of the Trinity. So, but they have this conception of a Unitarian being, and they say that we are somehow violating the uniqueness of God. And I always puzzle over this. I think, wait, when you talk about Allah in contrast to the triune God, it sounds to me like you've described a being very much like every other being I've ever heard about. It's only the triune God that sounds truly unique and incomparable, right? That the triune God is truly unique. There's nothing like him. There's nothing that can be compared to him. He's the self-contained God. Let me point this out. This is one way I think helps people enter into the kind of the idea of what I'm talking about. In Exodus 3, this bowled me. When I was a kid in prison, 18 years old, I was reading the Bible. I read it through twice before I converted because I didn't understand the gospel. I only understood my sin, God's holiness, and I was in trouble. But the thing that got me in that moment, those days, I was reading Exodus 3. God came to Moses and said, I'm going to lead you out of Egypt. I'm going to fulfill the promises I made to the fathers. Moses basically said, I like to think, I have a Jewish wife, Jewish believing wife, and I know how Jewish people are. They got some questions for things, right? And so Moses is like, hey, these guys are going to have some questions. I'm going to go to them and I'm going to say, I heard a voice emanating from a bush. And he said, we're leaving Egypt, the greatest superpower on earth. They're going to say, oh yeah, who'd you hear from, Moses, right? What's his name? Well, how's God going to give them a name that quells their fears or concerns? Would that satisfy it for you? Somebody comes back and says, oh, Joe sent me. Now, okay, now let's go, right? Well, somehow God's going to have to give him an answer that satisfies them. What does God say? Moses says, what is your name? So I can tell it to the children of Israel. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. When I heard that for the first time, I understand it better today than I did then, but even then, I was so overwhelmed by that, because think about this. If you ask me who I am, you asked me that earlier, and I told you. I mentioned I grew up here, I had this experience. I'm pointing to all these things. It's like if I say I caught a fish this big. You're thinking, that doesn't help me. If I do this, now you know. You have a reference point. Well, when I'm explaining myself, I'm making reference to other things. There are reference points. I could talk about where I was born. I could talk about my parents. Well, what's God going to do? Who's God going to point to as his reference point? The one apart from whom nothing exists. There is no one outside of himself to point to if he's going to ultimately identify himself. So what does he do? I am who I am. Yeah. I am who I am. He's pointing to himself as the reference point. And so he's saying, I explain myself. I don't need to look outside of myself to explain myself. I'm self-existent, self-contained. And that, I suggest to you, is the heart of the Trinitarian idea, that God is triune. He is love. He is life. He is a communicative being. And so that's truly a unique God. The God of Islam is dependent. In order to love, he has to look outside of himself. In order to realize any of these things, he has to look outside of himself. And so these are some of the things I talk to Muslims about, and I say, look, your God's not really unique. He's not really incomparable. My God is, and all these other things to boot. You have in him, he's truly self-contained. He's self-sufficient, and therefore he can be all-sufficient for us. And you know, I don't really get into analogies. I know people do, but I just think some of them, I don't know of any really that are perfect. They all break down, people misuse them, and so I just sort of stay away from them, and I'm content to use the biblical descriptions of God and say, hey, look, he describes himself as Father, Son, and Spirit. Obviously, these are terms that are derived for us from human experience, and it's a mistake to read everything that's true of those terms as they apply to men and say they're true of God in every respect. When we say God is a shepherd is somebody who has a shepherd's crook. When we say God is a shepherd, do you think that means he has a crook and he's pulling you back from some danger? No, you just realize the idea is he cares for us. He takes care of us. Well, when we say Father, Son, it's not intended for us to say, oh, well then this involves a physical act of procreation and it's a temporal act and all these things. No, what you're supposed to hear in that is, just like a son bears the nature of his father, so Jesus has the very nature of his father. Yep. He's what his father is by nature, but not who his father is. Personal distinction, essential oneness. So these are the sorts of things I point out to Muslims. And then I can also say really quickly, I point to inconsistencies in their own religion. You have to try and make up for what you've gotten rid of in Christianity, and it's never going to be adequate. It's always going to be inchoate. And so Muslims will say that the Quran is Allah's word. It's his literal dictation. But if Allah is eternal, then his speech is eternal. And so they say the Quran is eternal. So they do have an eternal word. And I say, is the Quran Allah? And they'll say no. I'll say, so you have two eternals. Isn't that shirk?
Yeah, that's right. That's 100% right. Yeah, it's a really good association to be made. I also think that one of the things that I tend to want to spend time on when I deal with this, and this translates better in Arabic oftentimes rather than English, but it is a very good line of thinking, because the one question that I always ask is, do you believe Allah is the one that created you? Is he the creator? Almost always they're going to say yes. There have been times where they're, well, I don't know. I mean, you'll get that every now and again, but almost always they're going to say yes. And then you just talk about the idea that anything that is created or manufactured, for that term, is always a reflection of the one who actually did the creating. It oftentimes is that way, unless what's being created is very specified by the creator to not have such a reflection, right? And we do see examples of this, but the one thing that I say is, if you believe that you were created by Allah, then what is it? I always ask them this, and I just leave it alone. Then what is it about you that's a reflection of the fact that he's the designer and the creator? What do you see in Allah that you think you share in common? Because the Bible declares that God made us in his likeness and image. What does that look like? And would you say that we're multifaceted when you look at a human being? Is there something inside of a human being that makes them unique? Is there some kind of a living soul? And they always say yes. Okay, well then you in essence are a multifaceted reflection of a God who is multifaceted that we will never be able to understand. And if by definition you are created by God, then as the one who's created, you will never understand the full complexities of your creator. And I think this is why his argument is brilliant, because I do the same thing. I stay away from the Apple illustration and I don't. Matter of fact, the deepest I've ever gone into this conversation in the last 15 years has always been to make a simple statement. The Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Father, but they're all God. And that's and that even in of itself still requires nuancing. You can't just, say it like that. There's an association that you can't pull when you make that representation that has to be nuanced. So I think that's a great answer. I think it's also a really great approach too when you're thinking about it.